evening. Just continuing to march through the Psalter. Remember, there's 5 books in the Psalter. You have book 1, 1 through 41, book 2, 42 through 72, and then 73 through 89, which is what we're in, 90 through 106, and then 107 through 150. We're in book 3. And today we're looking at Psalm 77. There's many more Psalms of Asaph in book 3 than there are in book 1 and 2, which is pretty much predominated by David, though we'll see some other Psalms sprinkled throughout the rest of the Psalter by David as well. But a lot of Asaph Psalms in book 3, and today we come to another Psalm of Asaph, Psalm 77. Give attention to the reading of God's holy and inspired word. To the choir master, according to the Jeduthun, a psalm of Asaph. I cry aloud to God, and he will hear me. In the day of my trouble I seek the Lord. In the night my hand is stretched out without wearying. My soul refuses to be comforted. When I remember God, I moan. When I meditate, my spirit faints. Selah. You hold my eyelids open. I am so troubled that I cannot speak. I consider the days of old, the years long ago. I said, let me remember my song in the night. Let me meditate in my heart. Then my spirit made a diligent search. Will the Lord spurn forever and never again be favorable? Has his steadfast love forever ceased? Are his promises at an end for all time? Has God forgotten to be gracious? Has he in anger shut up his compassion? Selah. Then I said, I will appeal to this, to the years of the right hand of the Most High. I will remember the deeds of the Lord. Yes, I will remember your wonders of old. I will ponder all your work and meditate on all your mighty deeds. Your way, O God, is holy. What God is great like our God? You are the God who works wonders. You have made known your might among the peoples. You, with your arm, redeemed your people, the children of Jacob and Joseph. Selah. When the waters saw you, O God, when the waters saw you, they were afraid. Indeed, the deep trembled. The clouds poured out water. The skies gave forth thunder. Your arrows flashed on every side. The crash of your thunder was in the whirlwind. Your lightnings lighted up the world. The earth trembled and shook. Your way was through the sea, your path through the great waters, yet your footprints were unseen. You led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. This psalm, as we can see from the beginning, Asaph is in a rather depressed state. It seems like the Lord is distant from him. We don't know the historical context of Asaph's situation, but it's in the dark night of the soul, as has often been said by the older theologians. He is feeling as though the Lord is away from him. And what we see in the psalm, in the 20 verses in it, we see this sort of trajectory from Asaph, sort of, as the older theologians, again, used to speak of navel gazing. He's sort of looking at himself and his estate and his depressed estate. But yet, as the psalm moves, as we've seen so often throughout the Psalms, he kind of moves, and there's this trajectory away from himself, and the pronoun I starts to become the third plural pronoun, and speaking of God as we get to the end of the psalm. So he's moving from this self-pitying sort of estate to this I that now takes himself off of himself and his circumstances onto God, and this revives his soul and gives him hope by the end of the psalm. And this is a trajectory that we would be wise to see, that we see throughout the Psalter, especially these psalms of lament, these psalms of sadness and sorrow. There's this constant sort of pattern of starting with self and the sorrowful self and moving the eyes away from self onto God and finding hope in the midst of despair. And we see that here in this psalm. I want to just look at three things tonight. You'll notice remembrance is really a key theme here in this psalm. I want us to first look at a personal remembrance in the days of sorrow. Second, we'll move on to see a reasonable remembrance in the days of confusion. And then finally, we'll see an historical remembrance in the days of hope. So that's where we'll be going here this evening, a personal remembrance in the days of sorrow, a reasonable remembrance in the days of confusion, and a historical remembrance in the days of hope. So first, a personal remembrance in the days of sorrow. Verse 3, when I remember God, I moan. When I meditate, my spirit faints. Verse 5, when I consider the days of old, the years long ago. Verse 2, my soul refuses to be comforted. Here's Asaph remembering the days of the Lord's gracious presence in his life. He's remembering when the blessings of God overflowed for him. He's remembering the goodness of God and the tasting of God's goodness, the days when it seemed God was so near and that warm and gracious countenance of God was upon him. I think something that we could think of that Asaph is going through, you could almost liken Asaph's grief to a parent who has lost their child. That parent, what do when they lose their child? They meditate on, they remember those warm memories of that child when the child was in their life, but rather than it buoying their spirits, it only enhances the darkness. It only enhances the sadness and the sorrow. And I think that's what you have here with Asaph. He's remembering the days when he and the Lord had such sweet fellowship, when it seemed like the Lord was near to him, and rather than it making him feel better, it brings him even into a darker situation. It brings him even into a more despondent spirit. He refuses to be comforted, like the parent who has lost the child, refusing to be comforted. And he's comparing those former days of God's blessing to his present circumstance. And the comparison of the light with the present darkness brings a despondent spirit and an almost hopeless estate here from Asaph. You know, we think of Paul's words when we have to ask the question from Romans 1 and 2, why do people eventually, as Paul says, call that which is evil good and that which is good evil? It is because they have grown so accustomed to evil. They have been so conformed to evil that they can't even remember or even think on what is good anymore. I think it's similar to, when you're in the dark and your eyes grow accustomed to the dark so that now you can navigate your way through the dark room, as opposed to, when you wake up, somebody wakes you up and it's all dark and you can't move and stumble about. But the wicked have their eyes and the eyes of their hearts so accustomed to the darkness that they know how to navigate through it. And in fact, that's where things are most clear for them, is in the darkness. The light is shocking to them. And when the light comes, they scatter like cockroaches. They're so accustomed to the darkness. Well, that's not Asaph. Asaph is in the darkness as one who has tasted the goodness of the light of God, and he remembers it, and it brings him into misery. He knows what it is he is missing. The people that dwell in darkness and wickedness, that have never had the light of their eyes and the eyes of their hearts open to the light of God's goodness, don't know what they're missing. And so they go on and revel in the darkness and call that which is evil good, but not Asaph. Asaph knows what he's missing. He's remembering those days, those sweet moments, the fellowship with God when his countenance, his gracious countenance was upon him. And while Asaph is going to move from a sort of self-pitying depression to the selfless Godward direction, the Godward direction, we need to note, begins with what we might call a godly depression, or what Martin Lloyd-Jones would call a spiritual depression. Not a depression that has no understanding of God or the Spirit indwelling an individual, but a depression that comes from one who knows the goodness of God, and for whatever circumstances have entered their life, they enter into a spiritual depression, a godly depression, because it's a depression of the light of God's countenance seemingly away from them. And he mourns that feeling. He doesn't just say, oh, well, it was nice while it lasted. I enjoyed those times of sweet fellowship with the Lord, but it's gone now to move on to better things. You think of Matthew 13, and the seed falls on rocky soil, and there's those that love the idea of the gospel, love the things of God, but then the cares of the world choke it out, and they kind of just move on. There's not a godly spiritual depression in those moments of the dark night of the soul, but those that the Spirit has taken deep root into the soil of the soul for, when they feel that God's presence isn't there, they mourn much like a parent does when they have lost their child. And so he mourns that feeling of not having the Lord in his life, and he longs for it more than anything else. Alexander Maclaren wrote this, which I think is helpful. Doubts are better put into plain speech than lying diffused and darkening like poisonous mists in his heart. A thought, be it good or bad, can be dealt with when it's made articulate. Can be dealt with when it's made articulate. I think that's a good lesson for us. I think often our prayers are often not what we are actually feeling. We are feeling despondent. We are feeling rejected by the Lord. We are feeling that he's distant. Yet our prayers are filled with so much Christianese language. Language that fits well perhaps on a Hallmark card or stitched on a pillow, but really doesn't suit the dark night of the soul, the times when man feels so distant from the Lord. Just as Christian cliches won't help a parent after losing a child, so also Christian cliches won't help a Christian who's lost the sense of God's presence in his life. And so Asaph gives us language to utter in such dark days. He gives voice to those who are in the valley with God. He articulates genuine spiritual depression, heartache, and he articulates it well so that we now, having it canonized for us, can recite it in such days. Whether it comes from sin that's entered our life and we just beat ourselves up for running back to it, or whether it's just hard providences that have entered our way, certain circumstances in life. Psalm 77 is for you to recite. Asaph is articulating how we express that heartache of feeling as though God is distant from us. But the psalm doesn't end there. That neither should our prayers in such times. As I mentioned from the pulpit this past Sunday, it has been said a justified Christian should never leave the prayer room feeling as though they're condemned and guilty before God. We have been justified. Christ has uttered the words, it is finished. We should never leave our knees in prayer feeling as though the Lord is condemning us. We should always leave with the assurance of his forgiveness and our status as righteous in his sight for the righteousness of Christ reckoned to us. And this psalm doesn't pick us up off our knees after reciting the first 5 verses and leave us in a despondent spirit. It moves on, which moves us to the second point. Reasonable remembrance in the days of confusion. It's true, isn't it, that when you're utterly depressed, you can't think straight. All you can see is yourself and your own sorrowful estate. But the turn away from this condition for Asaph begins in verse 7 through 9, where Asaph asks these rhetorical questions. Verse 7 through 9, will the Lord spurn forever and never again be favorable? Has his steadfast love forever ceased? Are his promises at an end for all time? Has God forgotten to be gracious? Has he in anger shut up his compassion? And so these are rhetorical questions that are meant to be answered in the negative. We're supposed to hear the implied no, absolutely not, to these questions. I think it's somewhat similar to what we hear from Paul, where Paul in Romans 6, remember after he's just laid out the the graciousness of God and that we are saved by grace and not by works, he then comes and he says, shall we then overthrow the law? And remember how Paul says, by no means. And I think that's what we ought to hear here from these questions. It is Asaph saying, by no means is the gracious promises of God gone and thrown away because of my circumstances. And I want to consider what precedes these questions at the end of verse 6. Then my spirit made a diligent search. Part of the reasons depression causes you not to think straight is because it really makes you intellectually lazy, doesn't it? When you're depressed, you can't get out of bed, and you just want to be this passive agent, right? People deal with depression in different ways. They might eat a lot, but maybe they'll watch a lot of TV. They'll find whatever avenue where something is thinking for them because they just don't have the mental fortitude to think for themselves. If you're in serious depression, if you've ever felt it, and I'll just be open and honest, I've felt it before. It's almost like a physical weight on your mind and your brain where you can't think straight. And here, notice what Asaph is doing. He's saying, I made a diligent search. He finally gets his mind straight and he sets it on what he ought to set it on. And what is it? He makes a diligent search into the character of God. Note some of the traits of God's character here in verse 8 through 9. First, his steadfast love, verse 8. Asaph is saying, is the steadfast love of God and his covenant promises, are they only temporary? Do the promises of the steadfast promise-keeping God go away, never to be fulfilled? Of course not, Asaph is saying. Again, by no means, as Paul would say, is the steadfast love and promises of God brought to an end because of my current depressed state. Second, we see his grace and compassion in verse 9. Consider Psalm 103, verse 13 through 14. As a father shows compassion to his children, so the Lord shows compassion to those who fear him. For he knows our frame. He remembers that we are but dust. Notice that. Notice the connection there in 13 and 14 of Psalm 103. It is in the moments of our weakest frame and in our acknowledgement of our weak frame. It is in those moments when we are in the valley and we feel that weakness in an acute state. That is what draws out the heart of God towards his people. Think of it. What does Christ come down from the heights of heaven for? Not for the righteous who think their frame is so strong, but for those whose frame is weak, for the sinner, for the sick, who know their need of a physician. And it is those kind of people that the heart of God is drawn out to. Those in their weak frame and those who are acutely aware of that weakness and that helpless estate. And I think it's worth noting what kind of characteristics of God that Asaph is recalling here. Favor, steadfast love, promises, gracious, compassion. We could maybe say in Asaph's condition, what brings him out of his despondent state is remembering the tender characteristics of Yahweh, his Lord God. When you are in such a state as Asaph, all you can hear is Sinai's loud thunder bellowing down on you, condemning you, can't you? That will do no good for Asaph here. He must make a diligent search of God's tender care for his covenant people. As the Puritans used to say, if one is dealing with the guilt of sin, you just give them grace. If someone is dealing with the presumption of grace, you bring them law. Well, Asaph is not in such a place where he needs law right now. He needs the gracious tenderness of a steadfast, loving God. We think of one who is utterly despondent due to his circumstances in life. I know who my mind would run to. Who do you guys think of? Job. That's the right answer. Good, Job. I think we often think of Job. He's kind of the thematic sort of figure in Scripture when we think of intense suffering. And it's worth noting how God addresses Job in the whirlwind in Job 38 through 41. He actually uses a word that's an intellectual word, a word that engages the mind. You have the refrain throughout those chapters where God says to Job, consider. He's saying, consider. Pull yourself out of your state of self-pity and consider the characteristics of God and consider who God is. And ultimately what God is saying is consider God and who he is. God says to Job, and really throughout all of Scripture, make a diligent search of me and my character, and there will be no charge you can throw at me that will stick. Make a diligent search of how I have acted in redemptive history, in creation, and even in these last days through my Son, and you will find no accusation against my character that will stick. And that is meant to be an anchor for our souls when we, who are so flimsy and fleeting and malleable and fickle, in those moments where we're in such a depressed state where we can't even think straight, the anchor of our souls are the attributes of God. The anchor of our souls is the character of God that is immutable and unshakable amidst our very shakeable characteristics and attributes. And God challenges us, he challenges Job, and he challenges us in such despondent states to search the character of God, and especially in those moments of guilt and in sorrow, to make a diligent search of his tenderness, his mercy, and his steadfast love. Third and finally, the historical remembrance in the days of hope. Verse 10, then I said, I will appeal to this, to the years of the right hand of the Most High. Notice Asaph is moving from appealing to his condition and from appealing to God's dealing with him personally in the past to now appealing to God's actions in redemptive history. In other words, Asaph has moved completely away from himself to God and the history of his dealings with his people. Verse 11, I will remember your wonders of old. I will ponder all your work. Verse 14, you have made known your might among the peoples. If we could put it this way, Asaph has moved from a what have you done for me lately, God disposition to a what has God done throughout redemptive history for all his people in all time disposition. As is the case throughout the Psalter, he focuses, as we've seen time and time again, on the Exodus event. It is the seminal event for Israel, when God redeems Israel out of their bondage to Pharaoh and Egypt. They pass through the Red Sea on dry ground, and the waters collide on Pharaoh and his army, and God establishes that covenant at Mount Sinai. It is that seminal event that we see pop up in the Psalter time and time again. And verse 10 really sums up what we have in verse 11 through 20. When Asaph calls God the right hand of the Most High, this is essentially what he is saying in verse 13. Your way, O God, is holy. What God is great like our God? God is the Most High. He is holy. He is transcendent, set apart from all other gods and creatures, and he displays his holiness through great and awesome deeds that he displays before the eyes of his people with his right hand. So he is holy and he is set apart and transcends even the circumstances in life that Asaph now finds himself. And this God that transcends all, including our dark valleys, is the God that interjects himself into history and works mighty wonders with his right hand. So he's holy and set apart, but he's also great. And he displays his holy greatness as he works miracles on behalf of his people and in the seminal event of redeeming Israel through the Red Sea. I want to close here this evening with verse 19. I love this verse. It's such a great verse. Your way was through the sea, your path through the great waters, yet your footprints were unseen. Your footprints were unseen. I don't know why that strikes me so, but I want to close with this verse. Now, I think here on this verse, clearly Asaph is thinking of, there's a historical reference, literal reference, we could say. God does, of course, lead Israel through the sea, not through the waters, but through dry ground. So I think you have this historical, literal reference. But also there is, I think, in the context of the psalm, in the context of Asaph's condition, a rich poetical, metaphorical reference here as well. Since for the ancient people, remember, the sea and the chaos of the waves was often symbolic of chaos and evil and wickedness in an individual's life. And when we look to the early parts of the psalm, I think we could say Asaph is in the sea. He's in the great waters. And Asaph finds himself in the midst of tumult, in the midst of the sea of chaos. He recalls the Lord's way is through the sea. It's not taking Asaph out of the sea, but the Lord's way and the Lord's path for Asaph is through the sea that he currently finds himself in. Psalm 23:4. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. The staff of the shepherd is leading through the valley, through the sea. Notice at the end of our psalm, the unseen God leads his people through the tumultuous sea, through the seen staff of Moses and Aaron. The unseen God, whose footprints we cannot see, leads his people through the valley, leads his people through the sea, through the seen mediator of his people. Why is Peter rebuked? Because he denies Christ the cross. He's setting his mind on the things of Satan. The path of God is through the sea, through the valley, and that takes visible manifestation when our mediator goes through the sea, goes through the valley as he goes to the cross, and that is the path to the glory at the right hand of God. So that when we look to the cross, we know that the dark days are not some random occurrence outside of the redemptive plan of God for us and our lives, but it is rather the path that he has set, which leads to his right hand where pleasures are forevermore. Through the sea, through the valley, through the cross-bearing incarnate mediator that we now see, whose staff leads us in the path of darkness into the light of God's countenance forever and ever. All right, let us go into our time of prayer now. Anything that we can be in prayer for this evening?